He laughed at her in front of everyone. He wanted them to see her as nothing. He didn't know she had already stopped needing his approval, 8 years ago. But when she walked out that door on another man's arm, his laughter died in his throat. The banquet hall in Seoul smelled of lilies and old perfume, the kind that clung to memory more than skin. Zuri stood near the entrance for a moment too long, her hand resting on the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of every eye she imagined were on her, though most of them she knew were not. 8 years. 8 years since she had signed papers in a lawyer's office with hands that didn't shake, though her chest had felt like it was folding in on itself. 8 years since Jaewon had looked at her like she was a problem finally solved. She hadn't wanted to come tonight. She had told herself twice that she wouldn't. And yet here she was, in a dress the color of dark wine, standing in a room full of people who remembered her as Jaewon's wife, before they remembered her as anyone at all. She saw him before he saw her. He was laughing, the easy, practiced laugh of a man who had learned long ago that charm covered more sins than honesty ever could. He looked good. Time had been kind to his face, unkind to nothing about him except, perhaps, whatever softness he might have once carried for her. Then his eyes found her. The laugh didn't stop right away. That was the part that stayed with her later, how it kept going for a second or two after he'd already seen her, like his body hadn't caught up to what his eyes were telling him. Zuri. He said her name the way people say the name of someone they've decided doesn't matter anymore. Loud enough for the people near him to hear. I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show up. A few people chuckled, not because it was funny, but because laughter is often just agreement wearing a disguise. She didn't flinch. She had learned somewhere in the quiet of the last 8 years that the loudest cruelty usually came from the places most afraid of being forgotten. I almost didn't, she said. Her voice was calm in a way that surprised even her. But I wanted to see how everyone turned out. His smile faltered, just slightly, like a crack in glass that hadn't shattered yet. He turned back to his circle of old friends, already reaching for another joke at her expense. Something about how a woman who couldn't keep a marriage together had come alone tonight. Hadn't she? And Zuri felt something old and tired rise in her chest. Not the urge to defend herself. Something quieter. The urge to simply not be in that story anymore. She was reaching for her water glass when a hand touched her elbow, gentle, familiar in a way that startled her more than it should have. Don't listen to him, the voice said. He was always loudest when he was afraid. She turned and there he was, Minho, Jaewon's best friend. The one who used to sit across from them at dinners, quiet, watching. Always the one who noticed when Zuri went silent at the table and Jaewon didn't. She hadn't expected to feel anything walking back into that room. She hadn't expected the one person who noticed her pain now would be the one person Jaewon never suspected. The marriage hadn't ended with shouting. It had ended the way most things that matter end, quietly, in the small silences neither of them chose to fill. Zuri remembered the early years differently than people expected her to. Jaewon hadn't always been cruel. In the beginning, he had been attentive in the particular way of men who are trying to prove something, to his family, to himself, to the version of manhood he'd inherited from a father who ran his household like a business ledger, all profit and loss, no room for feeling. Jaewon's family had money that didn't explain itself, warehouses that operated at strange hours, men who came to the house and spoke to his father in low voices, then left without shaking hands. Zuri had asked once, early on, what exactly his family's company did. "You don't need to worry about that," Jaewon had said, and something in his tone had closed the door before she could knock again. She learned slowly, the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark, by bruising yourself against the parts you didn't expect. She learned not to ask about the men who came late at night. She learned not to ask why Jaewon sometimes came home with his knuckles raw, his jaw tight, a stillness in him that took hours to soften. She had loved him. That was the part she never lied about, even to herself. She had loved him in the reckless, hopeful way people love before they understand what a marriage actually costs. But love, she came to learn, wasn't the same as being seen. Jaewon's world had no room in it for her fear, and less room for her voice. When she spoke of leaving Korea to visit her mother, he called it disloyalty. When she cried, he called it weakness dressed up as feeling. When she finally stopped crying altogether, not because the pain had ended, but because she had grown tired of it landing on deaf ground, he called that indifference and used it as a reason to feel wronged. It was Minho, oddly, who had noticed first. Not romantically, not then, just as a friend who paid attention where Jaewon didn't. "You've gone quiet," he told her once, at a dinner where Jaewon had left the table twice to take calls he wouldn't explain. "You used to talk more." "I used to think it mattered," she had said, and immediately regretted the honesty of it. Minho hadn't laughed it off, hadn't changed the subject the way Jaewon would have. He had simply looked at her. Really looked. The way a person looks at something they're afraid might already be broken. She never told Jaewon that his best friend was the only person who ever asked if she was okay. She never imagined that 8 years later, that question would still be waiting for an answer. The divorce, when it finally came, surprised everyone except the two people inside it. Jaewon's mother had called it shameful. His father hadn't spoken to Zuri at all, as though her leaving had erased her from a ledger he no longer needed to balance. Their mutual friends had taken sides quietly, the way people do when they're more afraid of conflict than committed to fairness. And most of them had sided by default, with the man who stayed in the same city, the same circles, the same life. Zuri had gone back to her mother's house first, then eventually built something of her own. A small apartment, a job she was proud of, a life that belonged entirely to her for the first time since she was 24 years old. She had not told anyone the real reason she left. Not the shouting, there hadn't been much of that. Not even the coldness, though there had been plenty. She left because one night, sitting across from Jaewon at a dinner table so silent she could hear her own heartbeat, she had asked herself a question that terrified her. If I disappeared tomorrow, would he notice what he lost? Or only what he was owed? She never got an answer she could live with. So she left instead of waiting for one. The divorce had been fast, businesslike, exactly the way Jaewon handled everything that no longer served him. He hadn't fought to keep her. He had fought instead to make sure the story people told afterward wasn't one where he had failed to keep something worth keeping. It was Minho who had driven her to the airport the week she finally left for good, back to see her mother, to breathe air that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else's family. "He doesn't know how to lose things," Minho had said quietly, as they sat in traffic under a gray Seoul sky. "He only knows how to replace them." "And you?" she had asked, not really expecting an answer. Minho had been quiet for a long time. "I know the difference between people you can replace," he said finally, "and people you can't." She hadn't let herself think about what that meant. Not then. There had been too much grief still settling in her chest, too much unfinished business with a marriage that had taken the best years of her 20s and given her, in return, a lesson about her own worth she hadn't asked to learn. She boarded that plane believing she was only running from a marriage. She didn't yet know she was running towards something she wouldn't understand for years. Back in the banquet hall, the present crashed gently back into focus. Minho was still standing beside her, his hand no longer on her elbow but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it in the space between them. Across the room, Jaewon was watching now, not laughing anymore. Watching the way a man watches something he assumed would always stay in its place, only to see it move without his permission. "Walk with me," Minho said quietly. "You don't owe this room anything else tonight." She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because some old, tired part of her still expected consequences for wanting things for herself. "They'll talk," she said. "They already are," Minho said, with the faintest sad smile. "They've been talking about you for 8 years. Let them have something true to say for once." She let him lead her toward the door. She felt Jaewon's eyes on her back the entire way. Heavy, disbelieving, the particular weight of a man realizing, too late, that the woman he mocked in front of a room full of witnesses had never actually needed his permission to matter. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Zuri exhaled, long and slow, like she was releasing something she'd been holding since she walked through those doors. Maybe since she signed those papers 8 years ago. "Why did you come tonight?" she asked Minho finally. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that carries more honesty than words usually allow. "Because I heard you might," he said. "And I didn't want you to face this room alone again." Something in her chest ached. Not the sharp ache of old wounds reopening, but a softer one. The ache of finally being noticed by someone who had been noticing all along. She had spent 8 years learning to survive without being seen. She wasn't ready for what it felt like to finally be seen by the right person. Jaewon found them 3 days later, at a small cafe near Zuri's apartment, not far from where Minho now stopped by more evenings than either of them named out loud. He didn't come in anger, not at first. He came with the practiced calm of a man who believed he could still rearrange a situation to favor him. "You could have told me," Jaewon said, sitting down without being invited, his eyes moving between Zuri and Minho like he was recalculating a debt he thought had been settled. "Instead, I have to hear about this from people at the reunion." "There was nothing to tell you," Zuri said. Her voice didn't shake. "We're not your business anymore, Jaewon. Neither of us has been for a long time." "He's my best friend," Jaewon said. And for the first time in years, Zuri heard something under the anger that sounded almost like grief. "He's the person who noticed me when you didn't," she said quietly. "That's not betrayal, Jaewon. That's just what happens when someone stops looking." Minho hadn't said much, letting Zuri speak for herself the way he always had, not stepping in to rescue her, only staying close enough that she never had to feel alone in the room. "You laughed at me," Zuri added, before Jaewon could find another angle to twist the conversation. "In front of everyone. Because you needed people to believe you were the one who walked away undamaged." "But you didn't walk away undamaged, Jaewon. You walked away from someone who loved you, and you never once asked yourself why she stopped waiting for you to notice." Jaewon didn't have an answer for that. He sat there, the silence stretching long enough to become its own kind of confession, and for a moment, Zuri almost felt sorry for him. Not because he had lost her, but because he still didn't understand what, exactly, he had lost. He left without finishing his coffee. He came looking for someone to blame. He left finally understanding there was no one left to blame but himself. Months passed the way slow seasons pass, not in dramatic turns, but in small, cumulative changes that Zuri only noticed when she looked back and realized how much distance she had put between herself and the woman who once stood frozen in that banquet hall. Absorbing laughter that was never really about her at all. She didn't hear from Jaewon again, not directly. Word of him still reached her sometimes, the way smoke reaches a room even when the fire is somewhere else. Through mutual acquaintances who couldn't resist narrating a story that no longer belonged to them. Through the careful silences of people who clearly knew more than they were willing to say. She had stopped asking. She had stopped needing to know. Her life, the one she had built slowly and without asking anyone's permission, kept expanding in the quiet after that reunion. Her work grew steadier, her days filled with a kind of purpose that didn't depend on being someone's wife, someone's disappointment, someone's cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. Her apartment, small as it was, had finally stopped feeling like a waiting room and started feeling like a home. Hers entirely, in a way nothing had been in years. And there was Minho. He never rushed her. That was the thing she noticed most in the early months. How patient he was with her silences. How he never once asked her to explain the years it took her to trust warmth again without flinching from it. He didn't need declarations. He didn't need proof. He simply stayed, the way he always had, long before either of them had a name for what that staying meant. There were nights she caught herself watching him from across a room, cooking quietly in her small kitchen, or reading with his glasses pushed up on his head, forgetting they were even there, and feeling something close to disbelief. Not because he was extraordinary in some loud, cinematic way. He wasn't. He was ordinary in the best sense of the word. Steady, unhurried, present in ways Jaewon had never learned to be, and never seemed to think he needed to learn. She thought sometimes about the years she had spent believing love was supposed to feel like proving yourself, like earning your place at a table that was never really yours to sit at unquestioned. Jaewon had taught her, without meaning to, that love could be conditional, dependent on her silence, her patience, her willingness to disappear a little more each year so his world could stay exactly as comfortable as he needed it to be. Minyo taught her something else, something slower to learn and harder to trust at first. That love, real love, didn't ask you to disappear. It asked you to arrive, fully, and stay. One evening, near the end of autumn, they sat together on the small balcony of her apartment. The city spread out below them in scattered gold light, the air carrying that particular chill that promises winter without quite delivering it yet. She had a blanket over her knees. He had made tea neither of them had touched. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, not looking at her right away, as though the question mattered too much to ask directly. Not are we happy, just her. He always asked about her first, a small thing, but she had learned painfully how rare small things like that actually were. She thought about the version of herself who had stood frozen in that banquet hall, dressed the color of dark wine, absorbing laughter meant to remind her of everything she supposedly lacked. She thought about 8 years of silence she had mistaken, for far too long, as something she deserved. "I am," she said finally, and meant it in a way she hadn't been able to mean anything for a very long time. "I spent so many years waiting to be chosen by someone who never really saw me. I thought that was just what love looked like, waiting, hoping, making myself smaller so there'd be room for whatever he needed. And somehow, without trying to, I ended up chosen anyway, by someone who saw me long before I even understood I needed to be seen." Minho turned to look at her then, his expression open in a way that still, after everything, managed to surprise her. "I didn't fall in love with you overnight," he said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't the reunion, or the walk out that door, or any single moment people could point to and say, 'There, that's when it started.' It was years of small things. The way you'd go quiet at dinners and no one else noticed. The way you kept trying, long after trying, stopped making sense. I loved you slowly, Zuri, quietly, for longer than either of us probably wants to admit." She reached for his hand, and he let her, the same unhurried way he always did. No urgency in it, no need to prove anything. Just two people finally choosing each other in the open, instead of in the margins of someone else's story. "I used to think leaving Jaewon was the bravest thing I'd ever done," she said. "But I think staying, choosing this, choosing you, without running from anything, might be braver." "Why?" he asked. "Because leaving was about surviving something," she said. "This is about believing I deserve something good. That's harder. Survival, I already knew how to do. This, trusting that I'm allowed to be happy without waiting for the other shoe to drop. This, I had to learn." They sat like that for a long while, the city lights blinking on one by one below them, neither of them in a hurry to fill the silence with anything more than what was already there. That, she thought, was the real difference. Not the grand gestures, not the declarations, but this. The ability to sit in silence with someone and feel, for the first time in years, completely safe inside it. Winter came properly a few weeks later, the kind of cold that made the city feel smaller, more intimate. Zuri found herself thinking more than once about how differently she moved through the world now, not guarded, not bracing for the next small cruelty disguised as honesty. There was a moment, in early December, when an old university friend reached out. Someone who had been at the reunion. Someone who had laughed, quietly, along with everyone else. "I heard you're doing well," it said. "I'm sorry about that night. We should have said something." Zuri read it twice before responding. There had been a time when she would have needed that apology desperately. Now, she found she didn't. It was nice, in a distant way, like sunlight through a window on a cold day. But it didn't warm her the way it once might have. She had already found her own warmth elsewhere. "Thank you," she wrote back, simple and unhurried. Then she set the phone down and didn't think about it again. That was the real proof of how far she had come. Not the absence of old wounds, but a quiet indifference to whether they were ever acknowledged by the people who caused them. She no longer needed Jaewon's regret, or the room full of witnesses to admit they had been wrong to laugh. She had already given herself the only apology that mattered. Lying awake that night, long after Minho had fallen asleep beside her, Zuri found herself thinking about the woman she had been 8 years ago, hopeful, hungry for a kind of love that asked her to disappear a little more each day. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in that banquet hall, dressed the color of dark wine, absorbing laughter meant to diminish her. She didn't feel anger toward that woman anymore. Only a quiet, aching tenderness, the kind you feel for someone who survived something difficult and didn't yet know they would be okay. "You made it," she thought, as if speaking directly to her younger self. "You made it further than you ever thought you would, and it was worth every silent, unbearable year just to end up here." Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent and constant, the way cities always do. Unaware of the small, private victories happening quietly inside apartments like hers, where a woman who had once been laughed at now slept peacefully beside someone who had never once needed her to be smaller than she was. She closed her eyes, finally, fully at peace, and let herself rest inside a love that had never once asked her to disappear. Somewhere across the city, in a house built on secrets and silence of a different, colder kind, Jaewon sat alone with a phone in his hand, scrolling through a number he no longer had any right to call. He had spent his whole life believing he could always win her back, that charm or money or simply enough time would eventually make her return to the story he had written for both of them. He didn't yet understand that Zuri wasn't a chapter waiting to be rewritten. She had already closed that book, quietly, completely. Somewhere between the airport and the balcony where she now slept peacefully beside someone who had never once made her feel like she needed to earn her place. He put the phone down without calling. Some losses, Zuri had come to understand, were never really about losing a person. They were about losing the illusion of ever being truly seen by them, and learning afterward what it felt like to be seen by someone else instead. She had learned that lesson the hard way, in silence, over 8 long years. She would never have to learn it again.